Right, so the fallout from the resignation of Foreign Office diplomat Mark Smith has now got even messier, as his reasons for quitting, that is, concerns over potential UK government complicity in war crimes, ignored as they were by those higher up in the food chain, notably the Foreign Secretary himself, David Lammy, appear to have now been borne out in legal opinion as well. Global Justice Now, an organisation which campaigns on, well, global justice, as the name implies, have sought professional legal opinion, and that legal opinion spells very bad news for the Israel Lobbied Starmer government, potentially leading them towards a day in court themselves for their ongoing support of Israel's criminal actions in Gaza.
For everybody watching their TV screens now, what we can see are appalling acts of violence perpetrated on civilians, on civilian property, and so on. Most people, I think, watching that would think this is absolutely horrendous. For me personally, my profession or former profession, as of last week, was to advise the government on the legality of arms sales. And when you look at what constitutes a war crime, it's actually quite clear, even from what you see in open source on the TV, that the state of Israel is perpetrating war crimes in plain sight. Anybody who has a kind of basic understanding of these things can see that there are war crimes being committed, not once, not twice, not a few times, but quite flagrantly and openly and regularly.
Did you raise this internally, this view?
Yes, so I raised it with the new Foreign Secretary, and I raised it at pretty much every level in the organisation. That's my duty, and that would be quite normal, I think, for public servants. We're very used to upholding the law, and so we would normally raise things internally that we might have a question over, particularly if we have a subject matter specialism, as I do. So I raised it internally.
And how did the Foreign Secretary respond?
I'm not at liberty to kind of go into detail about exactly how that internal process went, but I resigned from my role, and I resigned because of this issue. So you can put the pieces together, but suffice it to say that any response was not satisfactory.
Right, so that was a Radio 4 interview of Mark Smith himself, the guy at the centre of this Foreign Office war crimes storm, a diplomat of 18 years' experience, having handed his notice in within 6 weeks of David Lammy taking over his department, during which time Lammy had disappeared off to Israel not once but twice, and it was during that second trip, of course, that Smith handed in his resignation. Smith's background includes being a pen holder for arms export licences, literally one of the civil service staff in a position of authority sufficient to be able to sign off on these things. So he knows the legalities of them, the requirements, the strict rules regarding the export of arms, and having raised the alarm about such matters with others pertaining to Israel, it being his job literally to advise on the legalities of these things, and including with David Lammy himself directly, this led him to end up quitting his post. He wouldn't say exactly what Lammy replied to him there, would he? He was too much of a gentleman for that, shall we say. Merely passing comment that the response he got was unsatisfactory, and unsatisfactory to the point he quit over it, of course, and that we should put the pieces of that together ourselves, draw our own conclusions, is what he invited us to do from that. And it seems reasonable to conclude that upon being advised of potential complicity in war crimes, therefore, David Lammy didn't seem to care very much. We can, of course, quite easily do all of that, can't we? Where Smith said we can do that by looking at our TV screens, I would suggest that news sources on social media are far less sanitised, far more impartial accounting of what is happening in Gaza at the hands of Israel than certain British broadcasting corporations. We do have some foreign media on our screens, of course, before somebody yells Al Jazeera at me, who are, of course, doing a stellar job of reporting on this. And more people ought to be tuning into that station for further news where things concern Israel and Gaza. But Smith's point is no less valid, however, because wherever we seek to learn more of the ongoing events going on in the Middle East, watching that and knowing our own government are arming the Israelis, equipping the Israelis, manufacturing parts for the Israeli military machine, people can indeed draw their own conclusions and justifiably ask of our government, what do you think you're playing at? As for the legalities of the actions, most of us are appalled at what we're seeing in Israel, what they're doing, and what our government are aiding and abetting in by helping them, could probably surmise that it's all quite illegal. We've seen enough horrendous scenes of death and destruction to imagine, yeah, that's not legal, is it? But getting a legal opinion, a proper weighted one on such things, well, that's something else altogether, isn't it? Mark Smith's resignation was a damning indictment, of course. It was his job to assure the legalities were in place, and having decided they were not, and Lammy's department refusing to change tack, it would appear, to avoid being complicit himself, he chose to quit over that. But independent verification and checks are, of course, necessary too. Otherwise, it's one civil servant's opinion versus that of another civil servant or a minister. And this is why things have got messier for the government, because that is exactly what Global Justice Now have just gone and done. Global Justice Now, if you haven't heard of them, have been around for a very long time. They were previously known as the World Development Movement until they rebranded in 2015. They've been around since about 1970, campaigning on global justice issues, which have included opposition to TTIP in recent years, that chronic Tory trade deal from a few years ago that you might remember that would have sold our NHS wholesale to US health conglomerates for the sake of a trade deal, instead of carrying on the privatisation by stealth that, of course, is still happening now in our NHS, but also does a lot of research and develops options to develop parts of the world not getting a fair crack, and supporting global movements such as in the free trade and fair trade organisations and campaigns. Well, they have sought independent legal opinion on this matter of war crimes and whether our Foreign Office, our government, are complicit in them by aiding and abetting Israel following the resignation of Mark Smith. And this got published in full just yesterday. Global Justice Now having commissioned Sam Fowles of Cornerstone Barristers to provide a legal opinion on whether the UK could be in breach of international law for wrongs committed by the Israeli state. And Fowles has delivered and found against the UK government in an advisory finding titled Legal Consequences of the UK's Relationship with Israel in Relation to Israel's Actions in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Bit of a mouthy title. But the full ruling is only 28 pages long, and although I am not going to repeat all of that, feel free to Google it and read it all for yourself. I do encourage you to do that. The crux of this ruling centres around something called vicarious liability. In other words, can the UK find itself legally liable for what Israel is doing in violation of international law as a result of aid and assistance it is giving to Israel? Is the UK responsible in part for the actions of Israel, having helped them along to do it? The remit Fowles conducted his work under was against the background of the International Court of Justice's recent rulings, both on the 19th of July, where the ICJ ruled the occupation of Palestinian territory was illegal, on the basis, as that ruling was, of racial discrimination, land seizures by force, and violating the rights of Palestinian people to their rights of self-determination, and also the ICJ ruling of the 26th of January, where the court ruled in favour of South Africa, finding Israel plausibly guilty of the crime of genocide. Fowles also took note of another report which I've not covered previously, this one concerning the 23rd of May Independent Commission of Inquiry that was commissioned by the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, which found that Israel had committed multiple war crimes and crimes against humanity during their investigation period, which in their case was between October 7th and December 23rd of last year. Now, as I said, this full report is a not too onerous read, 28 pages. Frankly, that's not bad for a legal paper, a legal ruling, is it? Although I appreciate this is an advisory. But it's also not too technical to understand either. So it is well worth having a read of all of it yourself. But the conclusion reached is, well, it's the bit we invariably skip to read first, isn't it? At least I do. What are the findings? What is the legal opinion requested? And it reads, based on the above analysis, it seems reasonable to conclude that the UK, including individuals within the UK government, may be in breach of international law by reason of vicarious liability for wrongs committed and or allegedly committed by the State of Israel. A. There is a real prospect that the UK has provided aid and assistance to Israel which facilitated its violation of preemptory norms of international law, namely the right to self-determination and the prohibition of obtaining territory by aggression. It is at least possible, therefore, that the UK is vicariously liable for Israel's breaches of these rights. B. There is a real prospect that the UK provided aid and assistance to Israel, which facilitated its alleged commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is also a real prospect that the UK had the requisite knowledge of the facts of these alleged crimes, and that the assistance provided was, in the ordinary course of events, almost certain to facilitate the relevant crime. It is at least possible, therefore, that the UK could be vicariously liable for Israel's alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity should such crimes be proved. And C. There is a real prospect that individuals, including ministers and or civil servants, may have facilitated the commission of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is also a real prospect that the UK had the requisite knowledge of the facts of these alleged crimes, and that the assistance provided was, in the ordinary course of events, almost certain to facilitate the relevant crime. It is at least possible, therefore, that individuals within the UK could be vicariously liable for war crimes committed by Israeli personnel should such crimes be proved. What about Hamas, though, some of you might be thinking? Well, the ruling here is in relation to the UK's involvement and legal liabilities, and given it only has a relationship with Israel and not Hamas, to be guilty of vicarious liability it can only be as a result of crimes allegedly, as the article put in brackets repeatedly, committed by Israel. So Hamas actually don't come into this picture as far as this legal ruling is concerned, even if they are obviously one side in this conflict. Fundamentally, it seems if someone chose to take the UK government to the ICJ, therefore, they'd have considerable reason to be in a spot of bother, you would imagine. I wonder if anyone will, in which case. Meanwhile, just to compound the UK's potential role in all of this, journalists who choose to report on what is actually happening in the Middle East, as opposed to peddling the government line, now risk being held on terrorism charges. God forbid we discover what is really going on and what is being done by our government on our names with our public money, eh? Get the details of that latest atrocity concerning independent journalist Richard Medhurst in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.